All right, so this is a quick, just a quick agenda of what we're going to cover today. You should have a, kind of a rough idea of what we're going to cover based off the RCP, but we are definitely going to go over what's changed and how to get that process implemented into your workplace so that way you're compliant, but also there's limitation of the risks as well. So we're going to go over the written programs, what's changed with that, the labels, the SDS, which are now the new MSDSs, how to get in compliance with training, and we're looking at the dates of which the compliance should be already in. And then finally, too, we'll follow up with what happens once, if, hopefully that never happens, but what happens if you are inspected and what the COSHAs will be looking for. All right, so I want to just take a quick second and look at these chemicals here. So there is a reason why I have some of these on here. As you can see, you might have an idea of what the first couple are, but towards the end, I don't know. I can't speak Russian. I can't speak Arabic, so I don't know what those are. So the reason I put these on here is just to kind of give you an idea of there's so many different languages out there that these MSDS sheets or these new SDS sheets can be coming in that we had to find a way to standardize them, and that's what the GHS is trying to encompass. So I'm sure that you haven't seen SDS in Russian or Arabic, but it's kind of giving you an idea that there is a bigger picture of worldwide scheme of what is potentially out there for SDSs. All right, so now I went and actually took out the foreign languages, so everyone should probably have a rough idea of what these ones are. So just take a second and look at these chemicals. Which ones do you consider to be the most concerning? We don't have any polls or anything. Just take a second and kind of look over them. All right, so if you're looking at it, the most scary one, in my opinion, would be the dihydrogen monoxide, which honestly, if you think about it and break it down, it's water, H2O. So when you see this, though, it raises these alarms that something could potentially be wrong, but now you have this SDS sheet that's telling you, hey, it's just water, something that we have every day, so nothing to be concerned about. All right, so let's start to get into the real gist of this program here. So we're going to start off more so along the why. Why is GHS important to us as industrial leaders and the safety majors and safety directors in your workplace? So if you think about it, when's the last time you've gone through a day when you haven't used a chemical? And really, there's not a single day, because chemicals are essentially a fundamental piece in every economy and everyday life. So if you think about it as far as dollar-wise, it's a $1.7 trillion worldwide industry. So now it's worldwide, so now let's think about it on the American scale, and it's more around the $450 billion. So that's a lot of money. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of chemicals out there that are making money in this forms of just having it in the chemical state, but also using it to produce another product. So let's see here. Now you got to also keep in mind that the chemicals that we have, there's SDSs out there, like we already talked about, in different languages. These have a direct effect on basically every aspect of life. So you think about it from food, health, lifestyle, and honestly, the work is probably what you guys are here for. So, oh, sorry, that's my fault. All right, so this GHS is basically what it's doing is it's trying to standardize the approach in the worldwide scheme to kind of minimize the hazard and the risks that are associated with the chemicals that go in and out of the workplace. So let's think about it now. So we're defining and classifying hazards on just a well-rounded scale, so that way everybody has the same piece of information coming on this. It's really quick and really easy for you to refer back to, and that way you can help communicate the hazards, which is what the standard is, hazard communication. So that way you can help communicate the hazards to your workplace. So now it's something else to keep in mind, that this is actually, and while it is a standard, it's not a true standard as far as OSHA is concerned. It's more so of a program. It's more of a guideline, more of a thing that they want you to have in place, but there's no standard. There's not going to be an update in the 1910 or anything like that. So just keep in mind that this purple book that you should have already received, which is a GHS standard, will be coming out soon, and you should be using that as your new standard going forward. so now that we kind of broke down the whys and what the GHS is, let's go ahead and start looking at your to-do list. So what should you do? What should have you already done, most likely? So first and foremost is you definitely want to train your employees on what to expect, what the changes are going to be. So now in order to train your employees, you have to train yourself first.
Kyle, wasn't there a recent deadline for compliance when you had to have all your employees trained by?
Yeah, definitely there was. We're going to get to that in a little bit, but December 1st, 2013, you should have already had all your employees trained. So, and that's kind of the reason why we're breaking into this presentation now, because more often than not, when I'm going out and helping out different industries, I'm seeing that compliance date has been missed, and we're still finding people that are What's GHS? I don't know what that is. So that's why we're kind of establishing this webinar now, so that way you can start taking this information back to your workplace and developing it out to your employees. So that was the date, December 1st, 2013 was the date that you're supposed to have everybody trained up on this. So first and foremost is training. So when I'm coming into this presentation, I'm kind of getting the concept that you guys have some base knowledge of what GHS is. So we're going to try to keep it more on the basic knowledge, so that way you can take it back and make it a lot easier for your employees. So another thing that you're going to definitely want to look into is starting to cycle through the SDS sheets and bringing them, starting to cycle through the MSDS sheets and bringing in the SDS sheets. So
and that stands for safety data sheets, right?
It does.
To an outsider, I kind of need it broken down.
Sorry, that's again. So I have a little bit of background information and knowledge in safety. So definitely, if you guys have any questions while I'm going through this, feel free to type in the chat bar, or tweet us, or just let us know so I can slow down and we can get a little bit more detailed. So thank you. All right, so the SDSs are going to be the new standard for the GHS program. Standard, again, I say standard throughout the presentation, but it's not. Keep in mind, it's not a standard, more so a guideline. So we're going to cycle through those SDSs and get those MSDSs out, which are the material safety data sheets for the right to know standard. So now we're looking at the next point that we have up here is developing a new label and secondary container. So what that means is, obviously, you guys had the mindset that each container that's not the primary source of the chemical will definitely have to have some kind of label on it. So there's many different ways that you can do this, but it's definitely something that the COSHOs and anybody looking for compliance is going to be looking for. So we'll kind of get into this a little bit deeper too, but know that that's something that you'll have to start thinking about how you're going to implement that into your workplace. So lastly, we have on here create a chemical inventory. So that's essentially what that's more so for. That's more so for your emergency response personnel. So that way, if, let's say, worst case scenario, if something happens and your facility is now in emergency status and you need to let the firefighters or police officers or somebody know what they're going to be potentially exposed to, then you have this inventory list that you can provide them with, and they have the best knowledge possible right then and there. All right, so this is, again, back into the guts of the GHS. So harmonization, what does that mean to you guys? When you think of harmonization, that means everything's working really smoothly. That's what I think about when harmonized, like a harmonica, it's really smooth. So again, we're trying to develop this comprehensive system that we can continuously use, and we can put those foundations, that good foundation down, so we can continue to build off of it. What that obviously does then is it helps you by knowing what your risks are, because we know exactly what chemicals are. But now let's say we have a spill, and now we have somebody that maybe doesn't speak English so well, but we have the SDS in the same format throughout the whole entire world. They can just refer back to that label, see what the precautions are that they need to follow, and go from there. And that way your risks are controlled, but so are the workers as well. So it's actually like a little bit of a sleep insurance policy for you. And I mean, obviously, while you're going through a change in any kind of program, you know that there's going to be hiccups down the road, and there's going to be an adjustment period. Everyone's going to run into that wall once in a while, but you just got to get back up on that horse and finish it out. So once this program's established and implemented in your workplace, it should essentially take care of itself. So more of a, I guess let's say a low touch, high impact policy that we'll have once it's completely implemented into your program. So again, we're going back to this, and I'm trying to drive this home because this is an important fact. The scope of GHS is going to essentially be for everyone that's considered covered under 1910 and 1920, the OSHA standards for general industry and the OSHA standards for construction. DOT will have their own separate rules, but that's, we'll see as we're going on farther, that's trying to get incorporated into this standard as well, so that way it's consistently regulated throughout the whole entire process from cradle to grave of the chemical. So another good point to think about, it doesn't just stop at the chemical by itself. There's special considerations that you have to make if there's a dilute solution and also a mixture. Obviously, then you have two separate different labels that are definitely required to be present on that secondary container. Plus, you need to have the SDS ready to go, so that way, if something were to happen, that's available for your employees. So, like I said, and when we're covering or looking at who's covered, it's essentially pretty much everyone. And if it isn't everyone right now, you can imagine that in about a year, when the final date is here, it will be everyone. So right now, we're still waiting on the chemical producers to get the SDSs out. They have until June 2015. We'll get into the dates a little bit farther to get those SDSs sent out. But right now, you should definitely have your employees trained up. So there's two main elements that you need to consider while you're thinking about GHS. The classification and the hazard communication. So that's basically trying to mitigate the risk. So when you're thinking about the classification, there's three different types of classifications that you're looking at. The health and environmental hazards, which are kind of lumped together. They could possibly be split up into two, but we'll just kind of put them together, and that's what trying to make things a little bit easier. Physical hazards are going to be things that you need to think about too, because there's different kinds of considerations that need to be made. And then we kind of already talked about the mixtures a little bit, because there's the added chemicals on top of chemicals, which can produce potentially potent mixtures. So communication is the heart of GHS. So communication is basically taking this information and making it available for the employees. That way they can access it, and they know how to work with it and know what safety precautions need to be made. So that's the nuts and bolts of this GHS program, and that's really the same from the right to know, but now it's kind of putting a little bit more of an emphasis on it. So, and the hazard communication looks more so at the labels and the SDS sheets. All right, so what's different? Have you guys had a chance to look at, I wish I could, normally we have this conversation, there's a dialogue where I can ask questions. That's why if I'm asking questions and I know you can't respond, just know that I'm not losing my mind, just so you know. So when you're looking at the written program, essentially that's going to be the same. There's going to be some definitions that are changing, but pretty much the same. When you're looking at the labels and SDSs, that's where the most of the changes will be made. And then obviously the training, you can still use the same training mechanisms, you just need to update the information. All right, so like I said with the written program, essentially no changes need to be made at all. With the exception of updating some information and definitions. This is small, minuscule things that you can do but don't prioritize around. The prioritization should be around the SDS sheets and the labeling, so that way you're compliant. But like I said, just small definition changes that just so you're aware of it. Okay, so now the labels. Labels actually has pretty much done a 360 and it's a complete change now. So, but really it is going to be for the good, because it's going to be standardized, but everyone can see it and everyone knows what they're dealing with. But you got to remember that we already talked about the hiccups that we're going to be running into, and that's definitely going to happen. As you'll see in a little bit, that the hiccups, once the government gets involved, what happens is things get screwed up. Everyone knows that. So once you understand where they're coming from with that, then hopefully that helps with the hiccups a little bit easier. So they also took the transit labels, which were, I mean, they're kind of different than the standard labels. So you'll see that they're trying to work those in, so that way they're they're pretty much the same. So that way, if someone sees a DOT label, they know what it looks like versus an OSHA standard label. All right, so here's the new label. So you can see to the left, that's the old label that we were working with. So it had the standard, the triangle with the 4 quadrants and the different number ratings. You have the chemical name. The chemical name will be the specific type of chemical, and that's essentially the same. But you can see on the right, the GHS label has the pictograms on it. So the pictograms are specific to the hazards that are associated with this chemical. So what you're looking right now is on the right-hand side, something that's going to be flammable and also extremely toxic. So that's something that we got to keep in mind. So if you're thinking about it from the employee side of it, you look at the right-hand side, you know that there's some issues with flammability, and you know that they probably shouldn't be messing around with their bare skin on it as well. So the left, you have that same consideration, but now instead of numbers, we have just pictures, which is hopefully going to make things easier, and I think it really will, like I said, after we get over the initial period. But you also have the, it's okay. So you have the signal word too, that's another new changer. So the signal word is separated up into danger and warning. So now they know that there's a danger of this chemical, so that way they know that the level of risk is definitely a little bit higher, and they need to take a little bit more precautions moving into it. And then below it too, that's another new change, is you'll actually have the precautionary statement. So this is going to be the information provided that actually makes sense as far as what could potentially happen if the person were to be overexposed to this chemical. We talked about the pictograms. The other standardized information are the supplier information, the supplemental information. That's standard from both labels. But you can see, I mean, there's 2 completely different labels, and it's a little bit easier to understand and recognize the hazards with the new GHS label. And the numbers that are associated with the triangle, we'll talk about that later, are different, but you don't see that on the label anymore because it's kind of ambiguous, and you kind of can confuse it a little bit. So when you have those pictures, it makes it nice and easy for anybody to see it. All right, so here's those pictograms. So if you just take a second to look at those, and just kind of think about them. Try to look at just the pictures without reading the words underneath. See if you can get an idea of what they are before you actually read the definitions. All right, so let's look at the last one. So that one's, I mean, pretty much the most self-explanatory one that's on the board. But you can see that if this is dumped into the local pond, you probably wouldn't be fishing out of it very much later, or it'll kill off all the vegetation in the trees. So you know that shouldn't be around any kind of source of water or point of entry or anything like that. So that gives you an idea of the hazard that's associated with this chemical. So then there's the typical skull and crossbones. It's not for the flag, but it's for the same idea. If you mess with this chemical, it's potentially hazardous and could actually kill you. So seeing that picture is enough to put the fear of God into anyone, knowing that if something were to happen with this chemical, they need to take those precautionary steps in order to make sure that they're working safe. So
to an outsider, it's definitely easier to understand than those colors and numbers.
Exactly, and that's what it's supposed to be doing. It's supposed to be symbolizing everything, so that way anybody and everybody that sees these pictures knows exactly what they're for. So another one I like to see too is the skin corrosion. So that gives you an example of what's going to actually happen. It's going to eat through the skin, so they know that they need to have their gloves on. All right, so we actually talked about this a little bit already too. So we're talking about signal words, which are danger and warning. Those are the two labeled words that will be on every single GHS label. So if you think about it too, think about it as 2 separate sides. So a warning is the potential to cause injury, where danger has the potential to cause death. So those are the 2 split categories. So while warning still should raise the hair on the back of your neck a little bit, the danger will actually be the one that scares you the most, because that's the potential to actually make you not wake up tomorrow. So it's the clear-cut way to differentiate between potential death and just getting hurt or hurting yourself when you're walking away from it. So this is another example of a template that's used for labeling. So as you can see, there's quite a bit of changes that go into these labeling. So on the left, you have the old label format, and on the right is the more updated GHS label. So you got those pictures again. So what do you think, Andrew? Do you think those pictures are easier still?
Yeah, a little more straightforward.
Exactly. So, I mean, you're looking at numbers on the left, which should give you an idea, but I mean, if someone had no clue about the specific triangle, they see a 4 and like, 4 is a pretty low number. I'm not worried about that. When obviously the 4 is the worst it possibly can be. But when you're looking to the right, you see that there's skull and crossbones, and you're just like, oh, I better not mess around with this. So again, we have the same information on this. This is just another example of a type of format that you can use for the label. So we have the identifier, the pictograms, the signal word. You can see it on there, danger, so you know that that's potential for death. There's a hazard statement associated with this chemical too, so that's giving you the examples of what happens and what to do if something were to happen where you're ingesting, inhaling, or any of the other routes of entry. So it gives you just a quick idea of what's going on with the pictures, but then the background information is there too, so that way you know exactly what you're dealing with. So this is the final format that we have for a label. So this is another label that technically it is compliant, but I don't recommend. There's just way too much verbiage on here. And this is going to be the one that you'll see mostly on like the 55-gallon drums where they have the space. You obviously can't get that into a spray bottle. So this is giving you basically the idea of what's going to come in bigger volumes. But a really good idea of this is you can take this and get a snapshot of it. So that way you can store it and make it even smaller. You can take the information, which are essentially the top 4, the identity, the signal words, the pictograms, and the hazard statements. And then obviously you have to have the manufacturer and distributor information on it too. But you can use that information at a later date if you just take a snapshot of this, file it away, or make a digital log of this as well too. We'll get into some storage ideas in a little bit. So this is this is a comparison again. So on the left-hand side you have the information that was required on the old right to know standard. So you have a lot more information that has to be on it. Maybe too much information is a bad thing. So that's kind of the mindset they're going here. So they're simpling it down and then making it more streamlined. So that way they just have the pictures and the most specific words needed.
So Kyle, when it says internal label, who's putting these labels together?
So this label is if you're actually making it from your standpoint. So let's say that you received that, if you want to go back a slide. So you received this SDS with the 55-gallon drum. Now you can't get this onto your squeeze bottle, so what do? You have to make a smaller label. So in the next slide, you'll see that this is the smaller label. This is, by internal, it means that your organization is making this label, and you can print this off and put it on as many different squeeze bottles or secondary containers as what have you. So this being said, that you can put this small amount of information on there that's necessary, and it still communicates the hazard. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you, Kyle.
All right, so now we're looking at more of a DOT standpoint. So the reason that I'm not the DOT guy, I'm more the OSHA guy, but the DOT standpoint is kind of giving you a better idea of how they're going to actually standardize it throughout the worldwide, essentially. So let's think about back 10 years ago or so. They still had the information needed to be provided on the triangles that you see driving down the trucks, but it's more so just numbers and letters and stars. The stars are there, but now they're going to start being accompanied with the actual pictogram, so you have the idea of just passing by that truck. For that split second, you see the flame there, you know that there's something flammable. So what you're going to see more, the only other change that you'll see is that the layout is going to be, the colorization is going to be different. So the colorization is they're trying to make it a little bit simpler too. You'll see blue if there's something that reacts with water. And I mean, essentially what they're trying to do is make it so it's really easy for everyone to see and everyone to understand and communicate the hazards, essentially. And that's what this program is for, communicating the hazards. All right, so here's a pretty good example of some of the pictograms that you'll see on the DOT's side of it. So if you look at it, the only one that concerns me that you might not know is the 1.4. So What that's dealing with, though, is that's dealing with the previous one with the explosion levels. So that's a different sector of, that's one of the lower sectors of explosion levels, which should be accompanied with the one to the, Phil, can you see, they can see the pointer, can't they? No. Okay, so the one on the top left corner is the explosive material, so that the 1.4 will be associated with the one on the top left corner, saying that this is the 4 level. So again, something that you need to keep in mind, because there's going to be some confusion as we go, but in the long run, it's going to keep things a lot easier. So on the red one, that's going to be the flammable liquid ones. There's the flammable solids, which is the striped the white and red stripes. The blue one is going to be the one that produces more gases while the water is introduced to the chemical. And then obviously the oxidizer and the toxicity and the corrosive ones. But do you see those pictures on there, though? That makes it so easy for you to recognize what's in here and what the potential hazard is. So just keep that in mind. All right, so now we're going to get into the SDS sheet. So the SDS is essentially the biggest change other than the label that we have. So the SDS, they took it, there was essentially no rigidity as far as what they had to have in what specific order. So that could be in any order possible, which led to some confusion and led to, who knows, countless amount of injuries and maybe even some deaths. So what they did is they removed the flexibility that's currently instated in the right to know standard, and now it's considered to be the right to understand standard. So, and by standard, like I said, it's not standard, it's just a guideline. But that's going to give you the idea of how consistent each section has to be going forward. So the very first section that you see, at the end of this we'll have an example that you can look at to kind of give you a better idea. So the very first thing that you have is the identification. So the identification is going to give you the product, the emergency contact information, and it's also going to give you the nuts and bolts of the actual chemical that's being used. So that's going to give you the contact number if something were to happen, that you can call back and you can figure out if for some reason you didn't understand from the SDS, you could call back and get a hold of someone that could potentially take care of the situation. So then we're going to look at the hazard classification or identification. So that's going to be the basically what's necessary for each of the GHS labels. So that's going to be the signal word, the mixture component, everything that's on there as far as precautionary statement will be on there too. So then we'll kind of give you an idea of the thing that I think that the part of this changeover that's going to actually cause the most headache is going to be coming up on this next slide here. So just take a second and look at this. There's something that should pop off in your brain right away that should immediately concern you. So just take a second and see if you can identify it. All right, so what we have here is to the left is the old NFPA standard with the numbers so assigned for classification. And to the right, we have the nomenclatures for the GHS. So as you can see, the minimal hazard is now category 5, where the minimal hazard under the old HMIS system was 0. So like I said, once the government gets involved, things start getting more and more confusing at first, but hopefully they have the bigger picture in mind. So if you see that the category 1 for GHS is category 4 for NFPA and also HMIS. So there's going to be some transitional periods that you got to really hammer this down on your employees that, hey, things are changing, that you need to know that this is no longer a minimal hazard and we have something that could potentially cause your death here. So this is going to be a problem for a lot of people, but as long as you administer the proper training, there's no issue there at all. All right, so now we're back into the sections, and section 3 means it's the third block down. So this will be the third block down on every single SDS, is the composition information. So you're looking at, then again, more information as far as the chemical, the actual chemical name, what people refer to it as the common name, and basically the threshold limits and stuff like that that are associated with each chemical that's in the compound or the mixture, or even just the chemical by itself. In the fourth block down, you'll see the first aid measures. So this is getting more into the lines of what happens if worst case scenario happens. So we're looking more at the symptoms and the effects, what could potentially happen to the person if they're overexposed, and how are we going to control that. So that's the first aid section. So that's something that we should probably make sure that our employees know, just in case something happens. That way they know where it's at least, so they can always refer back to it. And then the fifth section here too. The fifth section, I'd probably say that most of the people probably won't pay too much attention to this section because this is more for the EAPs. This is more so for the professionals. But this way, if you have that chemical inventory sheet, then everyone knows exactly where it's at too. So obviously that means there are the fire explosions and all that. So now we're getting more into the environmental side of it too. So the accidental release is what precautions need to be put in place. So we're looking at, should there be a secondary containment system on this chemical, so that way if there's a drip or a leak or something were to happen, we can actually contain it. We don't have to worry about having a catastrophe. And then we're also looking at, if there is an accidental release, what's the PPE that we need to have to clean it up? Is this okay to clean it up with our bare hands? Could be. If it's sodium chloride, sure. What about, though, if it's hydrochloric acid? Probably don't want to clean that up with their hands. So it's going to have the PPE requirements, like your gloves, your hand, for covering your hands and your feet. But then finally, too, the emergency procedures. So every chemical is different. So maybe this chemical says that we should call the emergency system right away. Get somebody in here, get the experts in here to clean it up. But also maybe it could save yourself some money, and this is okay for your employees to clean up. So as long as these proper PPEs are proper PPE standards followed. So this section you could probably pay some pretty close attention to because it can be pretty useful. So the next section is section 7. So we're looking at here now is what are the precautions needed in order to store this chemical, to move this chemical, and to actually use this chemical. Like I said before, there's a lot of different chemicals and there's a lot of different uses for them. So there might be a special handling procedure that's supposed to be implemented on this specific chemical, but it could look exactly like another chemical that you wouldn't actually have to do that. So it's going to help try to lean these things out for you, so that way you can actually accelerate your process a lot quicker, but also know the hazards. So again, keep that in mind when we're going through this, is that we're trying to communicate the hazards that are associated in the most plain version as possible, breaking it down Barney style. So then the last section is section 8. Section 8 is what are we going to do? How are we going to mitigate this risk? What's the exposure that's actually associated with? So the TLV is the PEL. So PEL from the OSHA standpoint is the permissible exposure level. So what is the level that's acceptable for our workers to be working with? And that changes drastically with each different chemical. So this information gives you an idea as far as being compliant, so that way you're not overexposed. Now you have to get involved with the respirator protection programs, which can be extremely costly. But if you can avoid that because you know that the PEL is not you're not overexposed based on the PEL, then you don't have to worry about that. So then it also is going to give you some information as far as if it's carcinogenic. That's what the IARC is. It's more so for the International Agency for Research on Cancer. And then it's also going to give you some ideas for engineering controls to keep the exposure down, keep the risk down, which is what we're trying to do with this whole entire program. All right, so we've got a couple more topics, and we'll kind of take a look at an SES, an actual SES, and see what you guys think of it. So the physical and chemical properties. This is what's going to, if someone doesn't have a clue about this chemical, this is what they're going to notice. They're going to notice the colors. They're going to notice the smell. They're going to see all these other things involved too. But then it kind of gets a little bit more in details, and it starts talking about the lower and upper explosive limits, the densities, so that way you know if you're working in a confined space where you should be monitoring for the buildups. So that the physical properties is definitely something that you should keep in mind as well. So that way all your workers will understand what's going on with this specific product. So the stability and the reactivity, so that's something that's going to be more of the high-end user level. So this is something that a lot of your engineers will be looking more so at, but still something good to know. Because, I mean, who knows? It could be extremely corrosive. It could be extremely reactive. If, let's say you have a corrosive acid and then all of a sudden there's a fire, what happens next? You have the fire extinguishers and the fire suppression system goes off. So now you have this open vat of chemical that's extremely corrosive or extremely reactive to water, and now you're just draining the suppression system right down on top of the chemical, so that's going to cause extreme reactivity. So it kind of gives you an idea of your different kinds of control measures that you're going to have to take into place. So then the last section that we have, and I said there are 16 sections, but we're only going to cover the first 11 because it's more so related to the OSHA standpoint. The 12 through 16 are going to be more DOT standards, so we're just going to focus more so on 1 through 11. So this information here, the last section we're going to cover, is more so keeping in mind of how this chemical is going to get into this person's body if they're working with it on a daily basis. Is it going to go through their skin? Is it going to be something that they inhale? Is it going to be something that, well, hopefully they don't ingest it, but hopefully we know not to test the chemical by tasting or smelling it, but again, Barney style. So then once we have the routes of exposure developed and have a good idea of what are the possible routes of exposure, then we're going to start looking at the symptoms. Is it going to be something that we're going to notice right off the bat? Is it something that's going to be over time? It's going to be extremely carcinogenic. So this is information that your employees really do want to know, because no one wants to work with a chemical that's going to potentially hurt themselves with. So they want to know. They want to know what are the symptoms. What should I look for? And when should I start looking for these symptoms if I am overexposed? Let's go ahead and take a look at an SDS. So this is a system this is an SDS that I pulled up online. So just kind of give you an idea of what you're going to be looking for. So essentially, all SDS will eventually be available online, and that way you can access that information a lot quicker too, and that way you can keep it stored for your own uses. But this is kind of just an idea of what one looks like. So you can see right off the bat we have the identifications. So we have the hazard identification, which has the danger associated with the signal words there, right above the pictogram. And that's, if you didn't know anything about this, where's your eye going to go? Your eye's going to go straight to those pictures, right? So we're seeing that there's corrosive. So we know that there's something that potentially could cause our death that could supposedly eat through our skin. So that's where we know to look right away. So we know that there's a danger, and there's these two different pictograms displaying the hazard. And then also it follows up with the hazard statement. So this hazard statement is giving you, again, these ideas of what's going to potentially happen if you're overexposed. So we have the identification, the hazards. That's always going to be on the first page. So that's essentially the most important information that you have. So then you see the composition, the first aid measures, the firefighting measures, what happens if there's the release. So this is all stuff that we had just talked about, but it kind of gives you an idea of what you're going to be seeing on a daily basis. Keep scrolling down. So then now we're starting to look at the exposure controls, the handling and storage. So you can see that this specific chemical needs to be stored in a cool and dry ventilated space. So that way we know that we can't have it sitting outside. So this small 6-page sheet of information gives you so much information that you should definitely know where you should be looking at just for the quick tidbits of knowledge, and then you can kind of push some of the other stuff back. So let's look at the chemical compositions, the physical hazards. So we have the TLV levels, we have the upper and lower explosive limits, the densities. So a lot of information you can see. And it goes on to show you the stability and the reactivity and the toxicology information. So let's go back to the PowerPoint. Hope you guys are staying with me here. I haven't lost you guys yet. But this is going to be the stuff that is going to keep you up at night. So this is the stuff that you really need to focus on, because we're looking at compliance now. And I'm not trying to scare you off or anything, but I'm just saying that the hazard communication system, or the hazard communication standard throughout the last, I don't even know, 10, 15 years, or ever since they started doing the standards, the citations and all this stuff, has generally been one of the top 10 cited standards. And this last year is a perfect example. In 2013, it was the second most cited standard. So, and one thing I can tell you too is that they're going to be looking for this, and they're going to be asking questions. So let's look at the compliance date. So this is the date that hopefully everyone knew. I have a feeling that some people didn't, but now that we know it, let's start acting on it. So December 1st, 2013 is the the cutoff date when you're actually supposed to have all of your employees trained. So if you're not there yet, let's put these things in place so we can get our employees trained up and make sure we have a good digital log or a good log of who's been trained and when they've been trained. So June 1st, 2016 is essentially the end date. So this is the date when everything should be completely set up and ready to go, and it should be essentially rolling off itself from then on out. So this is more so on the employer side when you're looking at the manufacturer side, which may not pertain mostly to you, but some of you it does, I know. So like I said earlier, June 1st, 2015 is when you absolutely have to have those SDS sheets coming out with the product. You can no longer use the MSDS. So that's information that hopefully everyone knew if they are dealing with the chemicals, shipping out the chemicals, but it gives you kind of an idea again. So let's go back to this to-do list. So what's the first thing that we should do? Hopefully you're all thinking training, 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 training. So we got to make sure that we're having these training sites taken care of, these training topics addressed promptly, and you also have to have that accompanied with some kind of sign-off saying that we have done the training and Joe Schmo is completely trained up to snuff with this. Because what's going to happen is when the COSHA comes out, he's going to pull off your employee to the side and ask him about it. Like, hey, have you heard of the SDS, the GHS? He's going to start throwing all these questions out there that we better hope that they know the answers to. If not, they know where they can find the answers, because they will, unfortunately right now, they are lighting you up. So let's make sure that that's taken care of. So another thing that we need to do is we need to start getting the SDSs ciphered through. So there's a couple different ways that we can use this. So a lot of different companies are going to do it different ways, and that's perfectly fine, because as long as your employees know in your specific work site, that's what counts. That's the moneymaker right there. Some examples of some things that we've been seeing as we've been going out and doing inspections is, instead of putting an actual label on the secondary containment system, we see a colorization scheme. So what that does is there's like a sticker on it. If it's a solvent resistant sticker on each secondary containment, our secondary container, and then there's a color assigned to that. So then if you go to the wall, you'll see that there's a picture. There's a big poster, I'm sorry, that has this color next to it as well. And next to that color, they have the SDS label. So one thing I can guarantee you that this is a never-ending battle. You will always, always, always go out to your site, and if you're doing an inspection, you'll find one or two bottles that aren't properly marked. So we have to find a way to streamline that. So, and that's what we're thinking, is you put a colorization scheme, and then you have a place on the wall that shows exactly what this color is. So that way you don't have to worry about the label getting dirty, employees not knowing where it's at. So that's kind of the key focus there too, is you got to make sure that your employees know where they can go to understand what the chemical is. For an example, I was actually out at a place yesterday, and I found there's a good amount of chemicals that we had that weren't labeled, and they're in secondary squirt bottles or squeeze bottles or something like that. And it was right next to another bottle that was just complete. It was just water, just plain water, and it was next to the water was actually next to some acetone, which is the same color. And obviously, there's that risk for exposure. We should definitely, first of all, we shouldn't have acetone in a squeeze bottle. First of all, that's a big exposure, and then we should definitely have some other implemented safety precautions in place. But as you can see, that the water and the acetone, essentially, you couldn't tell unless you smelt it, and that's something that we need to start correcting, and we need to develop plans for it, so we don't have this issue anymore. Because, like I said, time in and time out, we're running into this. So let's start thinking of brainstorming some ideas that's going to work specifically for your workplace. So the last thing I want to touch on before we start answering questions is what are you going to expect once they start coming out to inspect you? So they're going to, like I said, they're going to pull off your employees, and they're going to ask them the questions that they should know as far as what's compliant with your program. So do you guys have a program? That's a question that they'll ask. So hopefully everyone says yes, and if not, then we need to talk to that employee. And then they're going to start asking specifics about the program. So what does this green label mean on this label, on this bottle? So hopefully they have the answers, but if they don't have the answers, hopefully they know where they can get the answers. So I was just actually at a citation, an informal conference with one of our clients too, just a couple weeks ago, and one thing that they are hammering on now is disciplinary action. So now everyone's got the negative connotation of what disciplinary action is, and I hope that we've talked about this, if that's the way it is, that it's not actually bad as long as you're correcting it as it goes. The disciplinary action is to cover your own end, but it's also to help learn and teach the employee what they're doing wrong, so that way they don't do it again. So, and if you have a specific procedure on file and you're not following it, they will know. They'll ask questions and they'll find out. So we got to make sure that we have a disciplinary action on file, but we're also following it.
All right. Let me pull up some of our Q&A. A few questions coming in here. Again, if you have questions, please go ahead and type them into the chat window in your GoToMeeting screen. Here's the first question. You talked a little bit about a purple GHS booklet in the beginning. Where can people get those?
You can actually request those on the Department of Labor site, or else you can go straight to the OSHA site and you can request those. That's the standard, and that's what the compliance is based off of.
We have another question about the PowerPoint. Yes, we will be sending out a link to the PowerPoint after this webinar is completed. You'll probably get that either late today or tomorrow. Another question about the term standard. You've emphasized that this is not a standard, but it's a guideline. Can you explain the difference between the two and what that means in terms of compliance?
Sure, definitely. So when you're thinking of standards, you're thinking of, well, when I think of standards, I think of numbers, because that's the standard that you can refer back to in the 1910. There will be no additional input into the 1910 or the 1920, essentially the safety Bible. There'll be no input into that, but you will have that purple book, which is going to be the guidelines of what the expectations are. So while they're adamant in saying that this isn't a standard, it's still an expectation.
So the term guideline almost sounds like you don't have to be in compliance. Is that?
That's not it at all. So it's expected to be in compliance, but it's not considered a standard. I hope that hasn't been confusion. That hasn't led to confusion.
All right. A question from someone in the trucking industry. She's asking, even if our drivers don't have hazmat, do they need to go through this training, or should it be for everyone?
Yeah, this is something, honestly, the reason that you should have everyone know, it's just the easiest for you. It's a simple training that they can take, but your employees that are employed with you definitely have to be trained on the GHS standard. So I would definitely get that person trained up as well.
So even if they're not hauling hazmat, they should be trained up?
Yep, definitely.
Gotcha. All right, well, I think that's all the questions that we have for today. If you think of any follow-up questions, our contact information is on the screen. I also wanted to let you know about a couple of events that we have coming up. We have 4 workshops and webinars coming up in the next 6 weeks or so. Benefits Communication Boot Camp, Cyber Risk for Transportation. We have one on beating the insurance addiction, as well as a NATME fleet accident training. So please check out our website to sign up for those, and we'll send you a copy of this PowerPoint shortly. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.